did play football for 11 years, so that came in handy there. How y'all doing? So it is my honor to introduce a friend and a colleague, Mackenzie Leclaire, all the way from Canada. And first, I want to say hi to Mackenzie's mom and friends and law firm in Canada who are live streaming, so hi. Mackenzie is currently getting her JD at Western Ontario University. She has a Bachelor of Arts and Master's degree from the University of Waterloo. I was privileged to meet her last year at the American Criminal Justice Science Conference in Virginia. I love going to criminal justice conferences because of the work I do and other things, and I love listening to research and things like that. And so she was on a panel where they were talking about sexual offenses. So I love going and just listening to scholars like that. And after I heard her speak, I was like, I need to go up and talk to her. She has an amazing story. She's doing amazing work. And you guys are set to hear the work that she's doing, the passion that she has from it, and also about her own story. And she's one of those unique advocates. So Mackenzie, come on up.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, David, for that very warm welcome, and thank you to everyone at NARSOL for having me. And thank you also for allowing my mom and my friends and my colleagues at the legal clinic back home in Canada to tune into this live stream. So today I'm really eager to delve into the topic of restorative justice approaches to sexual harm. My master's research, I'm going to have to get used to looking around this room. My master's research specifically looked at the impact of a restorative justice peer support group for people who've sexually offended. This study really allowed me to witness firsthand the contrasting impacts of restorative justice and traditional criminal legal system responses to sexual harm. So our discussion today will begin with a brief background on sexual offense laws in Canada before transitioning into the topic of restorative justice. The majority of this presentation will illuminate the nuanced perspectives that emerge from my research, highlighting the voices and experiences of those directly involved in navigating the world as people who've caused sexual harm. By exploring the practical implications and challenges associated with restorative justice in addressing sexual harm, I hope to contribute to a deeper understanding of alternative approaches to justice in our world today. On June 17, 1988, 11-year-old Christopher Stevenson was abducted from a shopping mall in Ontario by Joseph Fredericks. Fredericks faced convictions for sexual crimes, and soon after he was released on parole, he sexually assaulted and tortured Christopher for 24 hours before disposing of his body. After an inquest into Christopher's death in 1993 and with immense public pressure, the coroner's journey recommended the creation of a registry for those convicted of sexual crimes. In 2001, the government of Ontario established the Ontario Sex Offender Registry, operated under the guise of Christopher's Law. And then the United States essentially mirrored this approach in establishing Megan's Law. In 2004, the Sex Offender Information Registration Act, or SOIRA, was developed. And with this act, the National Sex Offender Registry database was created and is now maintained and operated by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Since the establishment of SOIRA, all 13 provinces and territories have created their own registries. In recent years, registries have failed to withstand constitutional challenges in Canada. In Ontario and G, the Supreme Court of Canada struck down on the provisions that required automatic registration for those that were found not criminally responsible on account of their mental disorder. The court also struck down on the provision requiring mandatory lifetime registration for those who were convicted of more than one sexual offense at the same time in RV Nadalavu. The court found that these provisions to be inconsistent with Section 7 of our Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which guarantees every Canadian citizen the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. As a result, a bill was passed in 2023 amending SOIRA accordingly. Registries in Canada are intended to be used as an investigative tool for law enforcement to prevent and solve crimes, but provinces also vary in their use of registries for a community awareness tool. Authorities in British Columbia are permitted to publicize the release of anticipated locations of folks reentering the community. Alberta also manages a publicly accessible registry for those deemed to be high risk. The key difference between registries in Canada and the United States is that in US, as we know, registries can be accessed by anyone and everyone, whereas in Canada, generally, it's only the police that have access, and any misuse of that data can result in very strict criminal penalties. I know. In Canada, people who've been convicted of a sexual offense are sentenced to either federal or provincial prison, depending on the length of their sentence. Similar to the United States, studies have shown that people who've sexually offended fall to the bottom of the status hierarchy in prisons, a hierarchy that's determined by the type of crime and the stigma that's associated with it. Their place within this status hierarchy often leads them to be housed in protective custody due to their susceptibility for violence. While in prison, folks are likely to experience a steep decline in social relationships. Research suggests that people who've sexually offended are less likely to receive visitors while in prison than people convicted of other types of offenses, especially visits from friends and children. They also face a lack of security. Those who are held in general population without that pseudo shield of protective custody face an extreme threat of victimization. And as a result, those incarcerated are in survival mode, which causes them to isolate, minimize, or deny the harm that they've caused and struggle to make any positive change. Taking accountability for their actions demands a high level of vulnerability, which is particularly challenging to achieve in such a hostile environment. The period of transition from custody to community, as we know, can be particularly difficult and contribute to the stress that's associated with being supervised in the community through various orders and restrictions. The Correctional Service of Canada operates a high-risk offender program and a maintenance program for managing folks on release in the community. The high-risk offender program is cognitive behavior-oriented and offers individual and group counseling, and the maintenance program is offered for those who have admitted to committing their offenses who need less consistent weekly, lower intensity relapse prevention. Circles of Support and Accountability, who's heard of it? Few? Okay. Circles of Support and Accountability is a pretty well-known assistance and support-based reintegration program. A circle of support consists of 5 or 6 volunteers assigned to an individual to assist them in all facets of their reintegration, so housing, employment, budgeting and financial management, spiritual development, moral support. Circles of Support and Accountability is a restorative justice approach in the sense that it provides participants an opportunity to build accountability and victim empathy and community in an honest and non-judgmental space. Renowned restorative justice scholar Howard Zehr, on the right there, wrote that restorative justice is an approach to achieving justice that involves those who have a stake in an offense or harm to collectively identify and address harms, needs, and obligations in order to heal and put things as right as possible. The North American restorative justice movement was influenced by indigenous teachings, faith communities, prison abolitionists, and the alternative dispute resolution movement. Looking back even further, though, the principles and approaches that are now being used under the restorative justice umbrella are grounded in ancient codes of conduct and practices used by many religions and ethical traditions across time. Restorative justice in the colonized Western world, however, wasn't born until the 1970s. Kitchener, Ontario, where I was born actually, is thought to be the birthplace of the modern restorative justice movement. As a young probation officer at the time, Mark Yancey, his picture to the left, arranged for two young men to engage in face-to-face dialogues with the people they had victimized through property damage as a result of a drunken rampage through a small town in Elmira, Ontario. What was an unconventional response to vandalism at the time transformed into a wider movement that proliferated across North America. And since the 1970s, restorative justice has been extended to more intimate offenses such as sexual harm. The first restorative justice initiative that explicitly addressed sexual harm was the Victim Offender Reconciliation Program established by Mark Yancey shortly after the Elmira incident. Victim offender reconciliation programs bring together stakeholders impacted by crime to meet with trained mediators where they discuss their experiences and strive towards reconciliation. A restorative justice approach in cases of sexual harm generally focuses on three things: fulfilling obligations, meeting needs, and repairing relationships. Howard Zare states that crime creates obligations. The primary obligation is on the part of the person who's caused the harm. They have to come to understand and address the harm and prevent it from ever happening again. Crime also facilitates obligations on the part of the community. Zare defines community as places where people live near and with each other, but also as networks of relationships that aren't geographically defined. Mark Yancey thought that crime causes disruptions in the community and that it should be responded to in three ways: by helping restore people who've offended in their communities, restoring a sense of community for people who have been victimized, and repairing the damaged community fabric. The community itself must take responsibility by upholding its obligations to help people who've been victimized receive the support they need, but also provide a supportive environment for people who've offended to carry out their obligations. The community's responsibility is, according to Howard Zare, to attend to the needs in which individuals alone cannot attend. Restorative justice seeks to provide a better balance in how all stakeholders experience crime and justice, and this includes justice for the person who's offended. In their restorative justice work, Alexis Sardina and Alyssa Ackerman stated that people who've caused sexual harm tend to feel a sense of justice when their needs are met. That is, when they have opportunities to create accountability, support in reintegrating into their communities, and encouragement to experience personal transformation. It's important to recognize that while folks are capable of sexual harm, they're also equally as capable of change if they're given access to justice. People who have caused sexual harm have complex and varying early life experiences that have often shaped their adult behavior. Sexual harm isn't random. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's a choice that's often informed by unhealthy attachment bonds, poor social and decision-making skills, and unresolved trauma in early life. Restorative justice provides an opportunity for folks to unpack the experiences that may have influenced the harmful behavior and choices they've made. A belief central to restorative justice is that a relationship is broken whenever harm occurs. So a restorative justice process involves repairing those relationships between individuals, groups, and communities that have been affected by harm and crime. It prioritizes restoring dignity, respect, and mutual concern within those relationships. There are three models of restorative justice commonly used with people who've caused sexual harm. Alternative or diversionary programs aim to divert cases from or provide alternatives to the traditional criminal legal system. Healing and therapeutic programs include victim offender reconciliation or dialogue conferences. Transitional programs are designed to help people who've sexually offended understand victim impact, develop accountability, and safely reintegrate. Circles of Support and Accountability is a prime example of a transitional program. We can also distinguish between encounter and non-encounter programs. Encounter, just like it sounds, involves a person who's been victimized and the person that's harmed them directly coming together. They have the opportunity to meet the person who harmed them, and this person ideally obtains a deeper understanding of the impact of their actions. Encounter programs adhere to what some call the ideal model of restorative justice, which emphasizes face-to-face dialogue and deliberation between those impacted by crime. But restorative justice isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, especially when it comes to cases of sexual harm where victim participation may not always be feasible. Factors such as the victim's willingness, safety, and availability are all crucial considerations. For instance, involving people who've been victimized in cases of sexual harm against young children or internet-facilitated offenses can be challenging or impossible. Circles of Support and Accountability, again, is the most prominent example of non-encounter program, where people who have been victimized are not directly involved, but community volunteers and professionals are present to help the individual understand the experiences and effects of victimization. The diverse array of restorative justice models really underscores the importance of flexibility and responsiveness in addressing the complexities of sexual harm, ensuring that the needs of everyone impacted by crime and harm are carefully balanced in pursuit of justice. With that, I'm so excited to move away from talking about restorative justice in theory and focus on what it looks like in practice. My journey into the restorative justice field is anything but ordinary. It started when I overheard one of my professors in my first year of undergrad talking to another student about the differences between restorative and retributive justice. I'm forever indebted to her and my excellent eavesdropping skills because I became intrigued by the idea of restorative justice. For so long, when I thought about justice, images of interrogation rooms, courtrooms, and prisons came to my mind. I had no idea that justice could look like conversation, like as an opportunity to heal the most intimate wounds. After the lecture, I went home and I Googled restorative justice organizations near me. And that's when I stumbled across community justice initiatives founded in 1974 by Mark Yancey in Kitchener, Ontario, shortly after the Elmira incident. As I was looking through their website, I noticed that they had a program dedicated to supporting people affected by sexual harm, people who had been victimized, people who had offended, as well as their families. I can't remember exactly what it was that made me click sign up on their volunteer training registration form, but in May 2018, I participated in a 32-hour training focused on restorative justice approaches to sexual harm. The training not only taught me how to be a facilitator of restorative justice, but it taught me the whys and the hows of sexual harm perpetration. The most memorable experience during that training was listening to a story of a man who sexually harmed a child. As I sat in front of him, I found myself forgetting to blink and forgetting to breathe. He talked about the abuse he suffered as a child and how that trauma carried into his adulthood. His bravery and the remorse in his voice is something that I'll always remember. And I vividly recall telling one of the other participants in the training that I wanted to facilitate support groups for survivors and that nothing would ever convince me to facilitate support groups for people who had offended. While I could sit and listen to one of them talk about the harm that they caused, I could never imagine sitting in a room full of people who had committed these kinds of acts. Fast forward 1 year to the spring of 2019, I was experiencing a very severe mental health episode, which I now know was caused by my post-traumatic stress disorder. I was in and out of the hospital a couple of times after having suicidal thoughts when I finally decided to disclose to my family and friends something that I had been hiding for the majority of my life. I wasn't what you'd call an easy child all of the time. I'm sure my mom listening to this agrees. I had a lot of anger and trust and jealousy issues. I had some difficulty maintaining friendships, and I had the tendency to escape into different realities, particularly video games, where I could imagine a life where I wasn't in pain. I would break things, I would fantasize about running away from home, and during my teenage years, I developed an eating disorder so severe that it landed me in the hospital for 2 months. In 2019, I decided to disclose that I was sexually abused as a child. My earliest memory of the abuse was when I was 5 years old. The abuse happened consistently and repeatedly until I was around 11 years old. I didn't tell anyone because I loved the person who abused me. I had a soft spot for him and I didn't want him to get in trouble. When I finally ceased contact with him when I was 16, 5 years after the abuse ended, that soft spot for him was gone, and I tried my very best to repress what had happened to me. No one needed to know I was safe now. That's all that mattered. And at the time, I didn't realize the impact of unresolved trauma and how it can come back to manifest in the present. So hearing from the man who caused sexual harm share his story in the training flooded my mind with memories I tried so hard to forget. And I now know that I was probably drawn to community justice initiatives, and that training specifically, because deep down I was hungry for answers. I've always been the type of person to search for answers and try to answer my questions and find reasons to things that I don't understand, hence why I'm in law school and about to become a lawyer. After I disclosed the sexual abuse in 2019, a few months later, I was asked if I wanted to facilitate a support group for people who've caused sexual harm, and I hesitantly agreed. I remember going into the support group on the first night, literally shaking and wondering what I'd just gotten myself into. I was 20 years old at the time, I'm 25 now, and while I had another facilitator with me, I never felt so vulnerable and exposed. Soon enough, the participants started entering the room and we started chatting about the weather and what we all did over the summer. We went around the circle and introduced ourselves, and my co-facilitator and I shared the group guidelines with the members. And it wasn't until about 20 minutes into the 2-hour meeting that the group members really started talking about things related to their offenses. And I realized I actually forgot who they were and why they were there because they seemed so normal and easy to get along with. I could tell in the first few sessions that the group members were struggling a bit to fully open up, and I could tell that they were trying to gauge my reactions to their comments and stories about their offenses. All along, I'm pretty sure they were more scared of me than I was of them. I remember after a while, they started opening up to me. We grew closer to each other, and then COVID hit, which caused us to move the support groups online. Even online, with each meeting, I could feel my emotional wounds healing by being present in that space. Knowing that I was playing a role in their healing journey, knowing that my role in helping them heal was preventing further sexual harm from happening. Being able to challenge them and ask, have you thought about it this way? Have you considered this perspective? So they dig deeper into the root of the harm that they caused was so unique and special. Over the 2 years I facilitated those groups, I let go of the anger that I felt towards the man who abused me. Even though I could never have a conversation with him, I found myself vicariously healing through my interactions with those group members. I vividly remember one of the group members actually reading out loud their victim's impact statement that they read in the courtroom when he was sentenced. This statement was written by a 6-year-old. As I listened to this group member talk, I felt tears streaming down my face. I looked up and I noticed everyone else in the room was crying with me. It was like this group member was reciting the exact words I would have said in a courtroom. Noticing the group members' genuine reactions of remorse was one of the most special and healing moments I have ever experienced. My time as a facilitator came to an end when I decided to pursue my master's research at Community Justice Initiatives. My research was generously funded by the government of Canada, so that's fun. The title of my thesis is on the screen. It's a mouthful. The question, though, that guided my research was, how effective is a restorative justice peer support group in helping group members fulfill their obligations, meeting their needs, and repairing their relationships? I was lucky to have built such strong relationships with the clients at Community Justice Initiatives, so much so that they were willing to sit down with me and do in-depth interviews about their lived experiences inside and outside of the support group. I conducted 7 interviews and engaged in an observation of a support group session. I interviewed 2 staff members at the organization, as well as 5 group members who were between the ages of 30 to 75, were previously incarcerated for a sexual offense, and who had been involved in the support group for more than 2 years. The group members had diverse histories of sexual offending, including rape, sexual interference, and possession of child sexual abuse material. The assumption behind my research is that if we're interested in helping people live crime-free lives, we need to be willing to learn from those who have managed to put their lives of crime behind them. My study reached three main conclusions, which I'll be going through individually. First, the support group members described the group as a safe space for them to create accountability. My participants talked extensively about how they carried out their obligations within the support group by engaging in the mental and emotional work of understanding and addressing the harm they caused. They also actively challenged each other to prevent the harm from happening again. Second, social support from peers positively impacted the group's reintegration experiences. They reported that the support group cultivated a sense of community which helped reduce feelings of isolation. Finally, the support group promoted healing and transformation. Participants shared how their peers helped them realize that a promising future after sexual harm was possible, which fostered optimism and hope. Restorative justice is an invitational process for people who've caused sexual harm to break the sexual offense cycle. It provides an opportunity to help them understand the life stressors and unhealthy coping mechanisms that have contributed to and maintained their offending behavior. A person must realize, however, that sexual offending is a harmful choice one makes and that justifications and denial of responsibility are incompatible with change. The invitation to participate in a restorative justice process is a really difficult one to accept because it demands clear boundaries, behavioral expectations, and true acceptance of responsibility for the harm caused. A misconception of restorative justice is that it's an easy route to addressing crime. Ironically, the traditional retributive justice process permits the person who's offended to legally agree to a charge without actually taking any responsibility. Punishment through the criminal legal system prevents the person from focusing on accountability because they often feel victimized themselves. To survive in prison, denial of harm becomes a defense mechanism, which is a significant barrier to building accountability. In essence, restorative justice strips away a person's protective armor to see the real human costs of what they've done. Restorative justice is also always voluntary because no one should be forced into accepting responsibility. Restorative justice can be thought of as a healing process that guides folks to acknowledge the harm that they've caused and see themselves as responsible for changing their behavior for the better. My participants spoke about what made the support group a safe environment where they could freely explore accountability. 3 restorative justice values, understanding, honesty, and voluntariness, stood out as most important to them. One of my participants stated, quote, "Talking about the offense is a really important step of accountability and responsibility. Talking about it with honesty, with being honest to myself about my actions, the place where I was in my mind, my state of mind. The support group has really been a forum for allowing me to share a lot and talk, which solidifies those thoughts of me being accountable to myself and those actions, being accountable to the victims," end quote. The group members shared that they felt deeply understood and that there's unbridled acceptance for their full identity, the understanding that they are not wholly defined by the legal and forensic imposed label of sex offender. They shared that the understanding nature of the support group created a sense of humanization, which fostered authenticity. Encouragement to be authentic was what the group members needed to finally open up about their experiences. During their interviews, participants said that they appreciated experiencing a lack of judgment, their acceptance for who they are, openness about being able to share anything, not being afraid, having a safe space where they can feel like they can be real. In the words of one of the participants, quote, "The way the facilitators get involved with us, the way they speak to us, they handle us with compassion, with understanding, with care and concern. They treat us like human beings," end quote. My participants also identified honesty as an important value in the space. The expectation of honesty is directly contrary to the dishonesty that contributed to one participant's offending behavior. In his view, quote, "I was being very dishonest with myself, pretending that what I was doing was somehow not hurting people," end quote. He explained that people who have caused sexual harm sometimes, quote, "try to justify their actions by pretending it's not causing harm, but if we truly understood or were honest with ourselves about what harm we're causing, it would be very difficult to live with ourselves," end quote. The group's conversation about loneliness and isolation that I observed demonstrates how one group member's honest sharing can help their peers understand themselves better. For example, one group member acknowledged that a sudden transition in life that led to feelings of isolation was one of the contributing factors to his offense. Another member expressed that the isolation he felt due to his job and questions around his sexual identity contributed to his first instance of sexual interference with a minor. At the same time, however, he recognized that while this was not an excuse, it was part of the explanation. Another member added that he would sexually offend when the sense of isolation became overwhelming for him during his unstable marriage. Someone responded saying that loneliness he felt contributed to his pornography obsession. I witnessed how honesty facilitated a conversation that encouraged group members to look deep inside themselves for answers to their own offending behavior. The act of looking deeper into oneself is an important step towards accountability because it involves exploring what contributed to their offense while recognizing that they must act differently moving forward to prevent more harm. The honesty within the support group encouraged vulnerability. The term vulnerable was brought up often during the interviews and observation. Vulnerability in this context is illustrated by the way each group member breaks through their veneer that in the past has allowed them to distance themselves from the sexual harm. As one group member put it, quote, "It's one thing to just tell myself I've taken responsibility. It's all good. I'm going to move on. It's another to say I have and continue to take responsibility for my actions. I talk about those. I talk about what I did wrong. I listen. Having those groups really allows that to continue to happen and allows me to stay true to my commitment to being responsible and taking accountability," end quote. To be involved in the support group, a group member must want to be honest. This is something that both service coordinators emphasize, that group members are not court-ordered to be there or forced to participate. For an individual to be ready to be involved in a group that places such heavy emphasis on accountability, they must truly want to understand and address the harm that they caused. In one participant's experience, he felt a drive within himself to learn from his past so he could continue to be a better person and teach his daughter how to grow up and be a good person. He conceded that if there wasn't that internal drive, it wouldn't matter what programs are out there. Simply just showing up is a way a group member can be accountable to themselves and their peers, and as one group member mentioned, accountable to their victims with whom symbolic steps of accountability are the only option. Symbolic steps of accountability are important in non-encounter restorative justice programs where there is no interaction between the person who's been victimized and the person who harmed them. A symbolic step of taking accountability in the context of the support group is putting in the maximum amount of effort to be present in the space. If a member voluntarily shows up to the support group, they need to be receptive to challenges and provide their peers with challenges. A challenge is a push to learn more, which is usually framed as a question. A group member shared with me that because the criminal legal system didn't challenge his accountability, he didn't feel the need to be accountable when he was released. He said, quote, "If there had been no support group, all I was left with was resentment for the system and feeling like I had been a victim. Certainly no accountability as far as my understanding of accountability. I just thought I just got beat up. I had emotionally got dragged. I did not feel any need to be more accountable than I already had. I did my time. I had my conditions. I had my restrictions. It's really hard for me to tell you how different it is having been in the group for a few years and being able to come to terms with accountability," end quote. Challenges around the minimization of harmful behavior often came up in the support group. An interviewee who was convicted of accessing child sexual abuse material expressed that being challenged in the support group, in his words, quote, made me realize that justifications I would use, that I'm not creating victims, I'm not taking the pictures, that what someone doesn't know isn't going to hurt them. All those justifications I used were bullshit, end quote. Another group member struggled with an overwhelming sense of anger over his victim's allegations. In his words, he needed help to get beyond that anger because it was causing him to block his willingness to accept responsibility and acknowledge accountability. This participant told me that his peers were able to detect that anger during his first peer review. A peer review is an experience undertaken by one group member who talks about their sexual offense and where they think they're at in their healing journey. Rather than it being an evaluation or an assessment, the peer review, according to the support group's guidelines, provides an opportunity to celebrate accomplishments and strengths and to reflect on areas of continued growth. All group members are assigned a date for this peer review over the course of the support group year from September to June. After the group member is done speaking during their peer review, the facilitators and the other group members have the opportunity to ask questions and provide some challenges to that group member. A service coordinator stated that the peer review is a beneficial tool in creating accountability and said that people are often surprised when they hear about it. She stated that many people view the support group as a soft approach to sexual harm because they believe the group is not challenging for the members. I sensed the frustration in her voice when she talked about how people tend to correlate challenging with acts of punishment, degradation, and dehumanization. She said that the peer review can be an emotionally difficult but important part of being a group member, as it helps them be challenged by others if they're not willing to take full accountability or minimizing in any way. Because of the restorative framework of the support group, a challenge is never posed in a harmful way that degrades someone's character. It's always offered with care. Being challenged means to engage in dialogue toward reconciliation with oneself. In the context of the support group, it means that a group member must accept that they've caused significant harm and withstand the pain of that reality, but do so in a safe and supportive container. The process of creating accountability is largely guided and supported by the support group facilitators. The support group uses a co-facilitation model where two trained community volunteers facilitate the environment for group members to choose and lead the discussions themselves. A service coordinator mentioned that having community volunteers guide the support group really adds a unique layer that would not be seen in staff-facilitated groups. I found that bringing trained volunteers into the space satisfies a core principle of restorative justice, that it's the community's obligation to address the needs of people who've caused sexual harm and help them safely reintegrate. I believe that allowing community members to engage in this space is building that capacity in our society to have difficult conversations about sexual harm. Access to social support is also imperative for people who've caused sexual harm, as they'll inevitably face stigmatization and social isolation upon being charged, convicted, sentenced, and imprisoned. Along with creating accountability, people who've caused sexual harm need to experience a positive reentry from prison to their communities. The support group fostered a profound sense of community for the group members, which helped mitigate the negative effects of stigma and isolation. In my study, reintegration meant the physical act of reintegrating, finding employment, building relationships. But for my participants, it also represented a larger symbolic process of reacceptance into their community as a law-abiding member. Reintegration largely centers around how someone sees themselves in their identity. Community in the traditional criminal legal context is very much controlled. People who've caused sexual harm are often told who they can and cannot be around. It's unstable as their relationships deteriorate and they struggle to trust. I also know that in some ways, community is discouraged, which can be seen in the ways that we continue to isolate and marginalize people who've offended sexually. Conversely, restorative justice promotes inclusivity. It provides stable social bonds and increases in social capital. And what I mean by social capital is that relationships are inherently valuable. Relationships provide resources that help folks achieve their goals. Our system really isn't good at telling people as they're going through it what's going to happen to them. The support group helps members navigate the reintegration process and difficulties associated with having a sexual offense conviction on their record. The group members shared that they needed the most help in 3 areas: managing grief, navigating structural challenges, and finding a community. People with criminal backgrounds experience what we call disenfranchised grief, meaning that the type of loss being grieved, the person being grieved, or the griever themselves are classified as socially unacceptable. While they grieve the life they once had prior to offending, people who've caused sexual harm are disenfranchised through social rejection and neglect because they're viewed as outsiders, undeserving of anything but moral condemnation. Unlike other transitional restorative justice programs like Circles of Support and Accountability, the support group provides a space for people who've caused sexual harm to speak with others who have lived experiences of sexual harm. The group members told me that it was important for them to have a space where they could talk openly about their grief with those who would understand them and where their grief would not be rejected. Folks must reconcile the fact that they have a vision of who they are that doesn't usually match with the narrative of who a sex offender is. The narrative is evident in studies on public perceptions, which indicate that members of the public believe people who've caused sexual harm are highly recidivistic, threatening to communities, and simply untreatable. My participants shared that the support group was a forum for talking about the grief that resulted from that stigma. As one member put it, quote, "Stigma is something that we all have, that we all deal with. We've committed a sexual offense that carries a lot of stigma with it. I felt like I had to watch my back everywhere I went. It was just the impression that I was going to get beaten in a corner in some dark alley by some stranger who just knew that I committed an offense. That wasn't reality, but a lot of other group members have experienced similar things," end quote. With ongoing support from his peers, this group member was able to address his grief and overcome that fear of violence. He gained a better understanding of himself as the support group gave him a chance to interrogate why, after over 30 years of his life, he chose to cause sexual harm. His peers helped him work through the grief and unpacking how he got here. He shared how his fellow group members who had been addressing their grief for multiple months and years taught him how to work through his own. This is an example of how group members engage in a collaborative process of leveraging or giving and taking from each other's lived experiences. I found that the group members really needed support around navigating post-incarceration as well as pre-incarceration because the organization sees folks who come to them before their sentence and incarceration, or they come to them without any charges at all. Some of my participants felt that the law was uncertain and ambiguous, especially in terms of the orders and restrictions that they were given by the judge. Group members were able to answer each other's questions and discuss their experiences. One group member discussed how he received support from his peers regarding other legal issues pertaining to the family court system and visitation rights with his children. Another member talked about how he secured an employment opportunity with a peer's help. Having group members at different stages of reintegration and healing in the group is extremely beneficial. One participant said, quote, "When you go into the group, first you're the new kid. You see others who are farther on their journey. You learn by example. You learn by what they say. Then as you move along, others come in behind you. You can share and you learn. It's that continuum of experience that was very valuable to me. You can't isolate a group of new offenders, people newly out of prison, or only people that are 10 years out. If there's just those groups, there's no growth. When you put them together, there's that continuum of experience that helps people. It's all about working together that makes it happen." This continuum of experience reflects a fundamental goal of restorative justice, that is to identify and address the needs of everybody affected by sexual harm. My participants talked about how the new group members provided validation to the longer-term members of how far they've come, an opportunity to spot areas of further improvement, and a sense of satisfaction in being able to lend their experiences to newer members. Simultaneously, longer-term members supported new members in navigating the early stages of their reintegration and challenging them to reflect on any thinking errors or maladaptive coping mechanisms. Being convicted of a sexual offense not only introduces grief and new challenges in maneuvering unknown systems, but it also places a person into a new social category. The sense of belonging to their community that they may have once experienced has essentially eroded. A common finding that came up from my interviews and observation was that group members felt a sense of isolation and hopelessness about the future. We know that the need to belong is a fundamental human need. A lack of belonging, often facilitated by stigma, has been shown to contribute to failures in reintegration and even increases in recidivism. Therefore, it's critical that there are avenues for people who've caused sexual harm to establish belonging and find that community. My findings revealed that the support group nurtured a shared sense of belonging to a group of individuals who are committed to change. This shared sense of belonging allowed group members to feel more connected to a community, which fostered a sense of intimacy and optimism about the future. As a participant mentioned, at the foundation of this community is the fact that everyone wants some kind of outcome, being a better version of themselves and not causing any more harm. They identified comfort in being part of a motivated group of people who have voluntarily chosen to be there. A major part of cultivating a community is for each member to accept why they're present in the space. The first step is taking that leap to voluntarily show up. Acceptance was difficult at first for some of the participants because of the stigma and their general lack of trust in others. Some group members I spoke with talked about how their relationships were not maintained because their loved ones just could not see past their offense, and this fostered feelings of abandonment. As group members immersed themselves in the support group, they became accustomed to that acceptance and non-judgment, which increased their trust in others. As one participant stated, quote, "Sharing gives direction and reassurance to one another. That's the major strength of this community and this room, the moral support, empathy, compassion, the willingness and ability to share, be accepted, and be reacted to, but not in a judgmental or negative way," end quote. The decision-making process in the support group also strengthened their trust. When issues arose in the group, they collectively worked together to decide how to resolve them. The way decisions are made in the support group lets them have a voice and ownership in the group. This sense of democracy, where every voice matters, ultimately solidified group members' trust that they would be heard and valued if they showed up. A lot of people who've caused sexual harm talk about not being able to be their authentic self while they were offending. A big part of being in the group is learning that they can. Learning that it's okay to be genuine and that there's so much more to their identity than their conviction. Interestingly, if a group member fails to remove their vulnerabilities, the group will be negatively impacted. A participant expressed frustration about a former group member who never accepted the challenges that he was given, and he was never really willing to fully participate. In his words, quote, "He didn't let himself be a part of the group," end quote. He emphasized that a group member must be authentic or else they will not transform the group, thereby illuminating the power of restorative justice and having peers together in that space collectively. He went on to say that an individual's failure to authentically contribute hacks on the group, and to add on to this, he revealed that months later, members of the group that found out that this individual eventually reoffended. He said, "It took us 2 or 3 meetings to move through that and discuss the grief that we were feeling, the anger we were feeling, the despair." This story really illustrates the profound sense of belonging that the group members feel in that group. The fact that one member contributed to such significant emotional upheaval demonstrates that a deep level of camaraderie is present in the group. The group members also talked extensively about the meaningful friendships that have formed between them. One of them described feeling at home in the support group, like he finally belonged somewhere, feeling comfortable in a space where people knew the worst parts about him. Feeling at home in the support group and feeling like he belonged somewhere helped him go from feeling hopeless and in hiding to feeling a renewed sense of worth and hopeful about the future. He began engaging in clubs and activities in his community once again, which helped him reintegrate. Earlier in his journey, paying visits to his probation officer was a constant reminder of his sexual offense, which lowered his self-worth and isolated him even further. The stories he heard about people who have sexually offended getting beat up was what he described as mentally limiting, as it made him not want to go out anywhere or do anything. As the findings have illustrated, reintegration is not simply the physical act of transitioning from prison to society. Reintegration for my participants meant being able to overcome emotional challenges and structural barriers that stood in the way of them feeling accepted. The support group was effective in providing the group members with a space to confront difficult feelings and situations that, in its absence, would have left them feeling scared, hopeless, and isolated. Peers provided insulation from the negative effects of stigma and optimism in managing obstacles, but also social bonds characterized by reciprocity, safety, and love. And finally, the traditional criminal legal experience, being arrested, sentenced, and sometimes incapacitated, facilitates a new life where one feels like a perpetual outsider. In their study of parole personnel, for example, Robert Worth found that parole officers treat people who've caused sexual harm as ghostly figures that are difficult to locate or contain. As a result, they see the commission of future sexual harm as pervasive and nearly inevitable. He contended that these pessimistic views regarding recidivism intensifies the fear, revulsion, and monstrousness of the dangerous sex offender. Transformation is measured through risk assessment tools, and folks are often limited in their capacity to grow and flourish due to being stigmatized, labeled, and ostracized. My participants shared how the criminal legal system turned a blind eye to what they needed to transform, the ability to re-enter society and put their lives of crime behind them. Interestingly, despite feeling stigmatized, being treated poorly while in prison, and harboring resentment towards the criminal legal system, they exhibited a strong desire to heal. They argued, however, that the system blocks opportunities for people who've caused sexual harm from finding meaningful avenues of healing. Instead of a healing journey, what my participants described the criminal legal system as was a carceral pipeline of marginalization where a deep level of despondency formed and a loss of courage was amplified. This despondency and pipeline of moving from partial or complete incapacitation to ongoing surveillance in the community complicated their ability to heal. Transformation in the context of restorative justice can be thought of as the rectification of the multi-layered harms associated with their offenses. It involves integrating new views of themselves and the harm that they caused. In my study, my participants often associated transformation with moving beyond the offense, becoming a better version of themselves, or feeling healed and whole. Transformation in this sense then is qualitative in that it's not measured by numbers, it's measured internally by how they feel about themselves. Transformation is resourceful. As I'll talk about, my participants' growth in the support group over the years allowed them to help others grow. In that same regard, transformation is contagious. Simply seeing their peers live a positive, fulfilling life after sexual offending helped them see that healing was possible. As one participant said, quote, "I met other members who had been through the criminal legal system and released 10 years prior at that point. They rebuilt their life, had a good job, nice home, great family, all these dreams. He was showing some pictures of some of the work he was doing in his backyard and all of these things he was looking forward to and enjoying in his life. He thought, well, wow, okay, there's a future here. My life just took a huge turn, but it didn't end. It's taken a huge turn, but I can rebuild and create a new version of myself going forward. In terms of healing, that was by far the most important part, knowing that I wasn't alone, knowing that there was a future." Having peers reaffirm that a future after harm is possible is important to combat the myth that people who've caused sexual harm are highly recidivistic and irreparably damaged. One of the group members told me, quote, "Being able to see that people who have gone through all of this and are building a good life for themselves on the other side is a huge motivation to say, I can do that too. I don't need to just give up on everything. I can actually learn from this, move forward, take what I need to do and move beyond that and try to become a better person afterwards. Knowing that that's simply an option to become a better version of myself after prison and to build a new life, to continue on with things, it definitely gives a lot of motivation to try. One of my participants shared that while he was incarcerated, he desired a space where he could talk about his offense and be listened to. When he inquired about the support group, he was worried that there wouldn't be space for him. He openly shared that he experienced suicidal thoughts and a desperate need to understand himself better. He acknowledged that as a man, there were very few spaces where he could be emotionally vulnerable, but eventually finding that space where he could do that was what he described as freeing. Transformation is a long-term process, and particularly when using a restorative justice approach, there's often significant growth in the areas of accountability and victim empathy. In the support group, group members often experience an awakening around who they are, being able to express things that they never thought they could express and show emotions that they never thought they could show. One participant, for example, told me how over time he was able to see the harm from his actions more clearly. He came to understand that his actions harmed not just his direct victims, but his indirect victims, such as his family members. He mentioned that for people who've caused sexual harm on the internet, it might be harder for them to develop accountability and victim empathy because there's more anonymity and distance between them and the victims. With that said, one group member shared his experience of developing empathy for his victims in the child sexual abuse material he viewed. Having his justifications for his behavior challenged by the group members made him see that he was erring in his thinking. Over time, he realized that although he didn't physically harm the children in those images and videos, he re-victimized them by watching their abuse and contributed to the overall demand for this material. Becoming personally transformed for this group member was a symbolic step to making amends to his victims through a genuine commitment to never access this material again. Another group member said, quote, "When I look back at where I was when I was offending, it seems like a whole world away almost. How little I knew of how I was dealing with things and how my emotions were at the time and where I was going. It's such a bad spot in my life, and now I can look back at it and start recognizing that, yes, this was bad because of the situation I was in, because I wasn't dealing with things and being open and honest with the people around me. It all spiraled together, leading me to a very bad spot, and I dealt with that spot very badly by offending. It was an escape mechanism." Realizing that there was a future after sexual harm and being able to witness their peers and their own personal growth ultimately helped the group members heal the relationship they have with themselves. They talked about how when they were deep into that offending cycle, they were riddled with justifications and self-hatred. Being treated with compassion by their peers and the facilitators allowed them to recognize their strengths, their humanness, and that they were deserving of love, feeling like a dark cloud had been lifted from above them. In the words of one group member, quote, "We leave the support group, we've mentioned just how much more energized we feel, either how much more energy we have or more at peace we feel. Depending on how the meeting's gone and depending on how things have impacted us, but we always have something more positive to take away from the group than when we went into the group. For me, it's also that sense of hope. Somebody said something fun, so there's that sense of joy that you take away. There's also that sense of hope, that sense of opportunity, just lifted to the point where, okay, I can do this, I can go on." It's really important to realize that there's an interaction between how a person sees themselves and how they function in their relationships. Experiencing a sense of personal transformation positively impacted group members' relationship outside of the support group. Restorative justice aims to prevent further disruptions to the community fabric caused by perpetuated harm, whether that be through victimization by the criminal legal system or stigmatization in the community. It aims to restore community members individually and strives to also restore feelings of cohesion and harmony in society as a whole. While I was not, unfortunately, able to explore the perspectives of the group members' loved ones directly, my participants did explain how they think their relationships benefited from the support group. They mentioned that their families are happier, their marriages improved. The support group helped one of my participants have more energy to be a better father and husband. For him, the support group has taught him how to slow down and be patient and have more empathy for his wife and daughter. Their experiences in the criminal legal system taught them that they were no longer human, that they were simply taking up space. Being part of the support group stripped away these harmful beliefs. For a couple of my participants, they even talked about how, after becoming involved in the group and spending time there for multiple years, they came to a point where they just felt ready to move on. Their recognition of needing more not only reflects their increased self-awareness, but also their capacity to give back to the community. They expressed that what they needed was to transition from being a group member to becoming a facilitator. This opportunity to give back to their community in this way seems rewarding to them for many reasons. And among these reasons, they explained is a sense of purpose and active engagement in community building efforts. I'd also add that it generates a sense of togetherness that transcends that organization to finding belonging in a much wider restorative justice community and movement. My interviews and observation revealed just how effective the support group is in helping group members fulfill their obligations, meeting their needs, and repairing their relationships. My study also demonstrates the impact of supporting and being supported by peers with similar lived experiences. Group members could relate to each other on a much deeper level than they could with their family members, parole officers, therapists, and other non-offending community members. Having group members at different stages of their reintegration was particularly impactful because they constantly gained new insights from each other. That continuum of experience made it possible for them to access relevant resources and achieve certain needs that in their absence would not have been possible. Having a diverse pool of experiences to draw from was important to the group members I interviewed because they entered the support group feeling hopeless and pessimistic, desperately needing to see that a life after harm was possible. As I've shown, restorative justice programs don't necessarily always conform to that traditional or ideal model like victim offender conferences. Non-encounter programs are so valuable because they provide community for a population that notoriously experiences heightened deficits in social support. Peers are often viewed as catalysts of deviant behavior, but my participants interacted with their peers. How they interacted with them, it showed how they can contribute to desistance from sexual harm. The support group's mobilization of restorative justice values really shaped those positive interactions, which were characterized by reciprocity and mutual respect. While the support group might not align with traditional views of what restorative justice looks like in practice, I'm of the position that people who've been victimized are symbolically present in the support group because they're always considered in the discussions, the questions posed by the facilitators, and in the experiences of group members who have also been sexually abused. During my time in the support group, I noticed that the silhouette of the victim is always present. None of my participants had the opportunity to meet face-to-face with the people they victimized, so being part of that support group was the most effective way that they could make reparations. I'd also add that instead of thinking about restorative justice as another intervention to crime, we should see it as an opportunity to facilitate a desire or consolidate a person's decision to desist from sexual offending. As a survivor of sexual harm, I empathize deeply with all people who've been victimized and the complex range of emotions that accompany experiences of sexual violence. From personal experience, I know firsthand the waves of anger, fear, resentment, and disgust that can overwhelm and persist long-term after the initial trauma. What I've come to understand, though, is that healing is not a linear path. It's a journey that twists and turns, marked by moments of progress and setbacks. Since 2019, I've committed myself to therapy and participation in support groups tailored for survivors, which have been instrumental in my recovery. However, unexpectedly, it's been my roles as a facilitator and a researcher that have profoundly impacted my healing journey. In those roles, I've had the privilege of walking alongside folks who have chosen to confront their actions with genuine remorse and accountability. Through conducting interviews and facilitating support groups, I've witnessed the courageous steps towards healing. I've seen them enter our organization with palpable desire to change, to understand the harm that they've caused, and to commit to a path of redemption. Each interview has been a poignant reminder of my own strength and resilience. I've been able to share with them that I too am a survivor and express gratitude for the profound impact that they've had on my life. Their willingness to confront their path and actively seek to make amends has been a source of inspiration and hope for me. Seeing them return to the support group week after week, grappling with the weight of their actions and supporting each other in their journey toward restoration, it's been a testament to the human capacity for growth and transformation. It takes an immense amount of courage to confront the darkest chapters of one's life and strive towards personal and moral renewal. Through these interactions, I've come to appreciate that healing is not a solitary endeavor. It's often found in the connections that we forge and the empathy that we extend to others. My work as a researcher has also deepened my understanding of the complexities surrounding sexual violence, providing me with insights that will continue to inform my own healing, advocacy efforts, and my future legal career. My journey has taught me that healing is multifaceted and that true progress often lies in confronting discomfort and embracing empathy. It's a journey marked by resilience, compassion, and a commitment to understanding the nuances of trauma and recovery. Restorative justice isn't the answer to all acts of crime and harm, nor is it a fit for every person who's been victimized. We still need to strike a careful balance between their needs and community safety. Most people who've sexually offended will not be incarcerated for life and will eventually need to re-enter their communities. Their path to reintegration resembles a precarious tightrope walk fraught with challenges and pitfalls. Expecting them to adhere to societal norms and legal boundaries without adequate resources or support is not just unrealistic, but it's counterproductive. Here, restorative justice emerges as a vital framework offering a balancing beam of support. As we envision a future where rehabilitation is synonymous with opportunity rather than punishment, we must shoulder the responsibility to cultivate environments that provide people who've sexually offended with opportunity. It's about creating spaces where people can confront their actions, make amends, and ultimately contribute positively to society. Restorative justice, in its essence, invites us to reimagine justice itself, not as a rigid system of retribution, but as a transformative process of healing and reconciliation. It reminds us that while the journey forward may be theirs to walk, the foundation upon which they tread is ours to fortify. Thank you.
I have a comment from the live stream.
Okay.
As her mom, I'd like to take her experiences away. That said, look at her now. I can't even begin to explain my pride. This is proof that from horrible experiences come amazement, growth, and healing. She has made me a better person. To everyone there, give her the biggest hug for me.
I'll start with right side. Yeah.
You mentioned that a frequent factor that was brought up in these groups was loneliness as a driving motivator for these types of sexual behaviors, which is something that I've seen with my interactions with people who have developed patterns of behavior with various kinds of pornography, including child pornography, as kind of coping mechanisms for that loneliness. And I'm wondering, these groups may do a good job of providing better behaviors and strategies for dealing with that loneliness for people who have already offended and have therefore found these groups. Mm-hmm. But what can we do to help ameliorate that loneliness for people like teenagers and young adults who are maybe the most vulnerable for beginning these behaviors and these unhealthy coping mechanisms?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And there's actually a program in Canada called Talking for Change, which is, I believe, part of the Canadian Mental Health Association. And they provide proactive support for folks who are experiencing urges to view child sexual abuse material or offend against children. And I believe that they help not only people in Canada, but around the world. So it's called Talking for Change. So it's good to know that there are programs like that out there. Yes.
Couple of quick questions. What is a typical size for these groups, or the most effective size that you see?
They're typically between 6 to 10 members. You don't want to have too few just because there's not too many people chatting. Some people are quieter than others, but I wouldn't go more than 10 just because there's a lot of talking to be done in those 2 hours, and yeah. So between 6 to 10.
And how long do they participate in these programs?
So each session is 2 hours. They go each week from September to June, and they can stay in these groups for as long as they want. They're not court ordered to be there. It's voluntary. Some are there for 6, 7, 8 years. Others just stay for a couple of years, but it's really up to them.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
All right, so my question is going to be a little bit anecdotal.
Okay.
There was a person in my family who caused harm to multiple females in my family, including my mother. And she had told me about it, and sometime later, this person rolled his semi off the side of a mountain and he sustained a brain injury. But after that injury, my mother confronted the person, and they didn't remember it. And my mom had told me about it, and I said, "Don't you feel robbed of justice? You know, that's, anyway," and she said, "No, that's something that they're going to have to live with now." And so I suppose that's her form of justice in that situation. And so I was curious if yours is finding healing by confronting people who are in the same position of people who cause harm.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Justice is very subjective, right? It means something different to everyone. Yes, I would say in a lot of ways I found justice in holding the group members accountable and talking to them, because it just wouldn't have been possible for me to have a conversation with the person who abused me. I have a lot of forgiveness in my heart, and I know that probably punishment for him is living with the truth of those actions and not having me in his life. So I kind of feel similarly. But yeah, justice for me was interacting with those group members, and they kind of served as a proxy for the person that abused me. Thank you for sharing that.
Hello. So there was a point in the presentation where you're talking about someone who downloaded child pornography who could not understand the harm that they were causing, and this is my story. I downloaded child pornography and had a similar sort of issue where I could not understand what the harm was, but I did realize at the beginning of treatment what I was doing and why it was harmful, and I really did realize why that was important to my recovery. The part that I was struggling though with was getting my family, my parents to see this, because parents do want to protect their children. And we do live in an adversarial kind of society where confessing to crimes is not really condoned or beneficial. It's self-defeating. So I was wondering if you've ever worked with parents, because I noticed that when I was on probation, it kind of became problematic because I would be accountable in group and I would accept this, but then my parents would, behind my back, would go and message my treatment providers and probation officers saying, I didn't do anything wrong and didn't deserve this and yada yada. And I was accused of being manipulative. So I was kind of wondering if you've ever worked with parents with this kind of, similar sort of issue of being able to accept that they can still love a person and accept that they did something wrong.
I've never worked with parents, but I've worked with family members, specifically spouses. And it's hard, it's difficult, and it's different for everyone to come to terms with that. I would recommend probably providing them with some resources, journal articles, or even op-eds of people who've sexually offended, or researchers or advocates that explain what accountability is and how to support a child that's sexually offended. I can also forward a list of books and resources that I know of to Andy, and he can hopefully share that. If not, I can take your email and I can send those to you, and hopefully you would find them helpful. I haven't had personal experience dealing with parents, but I'm sure that's a very common thing that people deal with, so yeah.
Okay, so our state, a few years before I started treatment, changed their program to a restorative justice program. So going through it, and I'm watching your slides, and I literally could see it. I could see it in my eyes. But yet I have a member in my state who knows somebody who's going through that treatment, and they're talking about the criminal part. So yes, they've gone to the restorative, but they still use parts of that criminal part. How do we get Department of Corrections to go strictly restorative? How do we explain to them that you're still using some criminal and some procedures that are still on the criminal side, not the restorative justice side?
That's a really good question, and I wish I had the answer or some idea. I think it's all about balance, right? It's about balancing community safety, people who do pose a risk, but also just having options there for folks who are willing to become involved in restorative justice, to take accountability, to learn about victim empathy. It's about having those options there. And unfortunately, I don't really see any time in the near future us being able to separate those types of justices and solely focus on restorative justice. But I think it's just important for now that we have more of those options.
Okay. Hi. Some people who have actually experienced sexual harm go on later to commit sexual harm themselves. Is the restorative justice process any different for them?
No, actually, this organization offers support groups as well for people that have been victimized as children and then later offend. So there's specific support groups for that, but even in the support groups for people who've caused sexual harm, like the general ones, a lot of them have histories of child sexual abuse, so it's the same process for them. It's all about healing that unresolved trauma that may have contributed to their adult behavior. Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. Thank you.